plain truth discussion where no conspiratorial rock will be left unturned, no mainstream propaganda will go unchallenged, and all reality boxes will be shattered. Co-piloting the storm clouds are Time Monk veterans Patrick, Herm, and myself, the Tea Drinking Rabbit, Oolong. Tonight's frequency is being broadcast across the secure Time Monk radio channels. So sit back, buckle your seatbelts, and ensure all overhead bins are secured because we are definitely in for a very turbulent ride. Tonight's topic is alchemy, and our special guest is Robert Bartlett. To learn more about his work, please visit his website at www.spagyricus.com, and that is SPAGYRICUS.com. So, Plain, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thanks, Oolong. Well, Robert, thanks very much for coming this week. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yes, well, I've been interested in your work for a long time. So I guess we can start out with all the usual questions that people have. What is alchemy and how does one get interested in it? How did this happen? So maybe you can give us a short take on, I guess you'd say, the history of alchemy. Of course, the name comes from the Arabic and Egypt and all that. So I guess that's a good place to start, right, with Western alchemy.
Yeah, Western alchemy, it's pretty much agreed that it began in ancient Egypt, especially around the later end of Egyptian history in the Ptolemaic period, around 200 BC. Really began when Egyptian technology and Greek philosophy collided and became a subject of great interest in the ancient world. It really was the philosophy of nature, and really began as a philosophy, trying to answer the questions of who are we, why are we here, what are we doing, and what is the true nature of reality. That's really the beginning of alchemy, was philosophy.
And it was related to astrology and I guess at some point the Kabbalah, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Astrology and Kabbalah pretty much grew up together. Kabbalah is really it's a collection of ideas. Kabbalah, most people consider it as the ancient Jewish tradition of an esoteric interpretation of the Bible, but the roots of it go back much further, and the ideas are really anchored in the ideas of natural magic and study of the forces of how the one, the source of all, becomes the many, and really provides the framework for alchemical ideas.
Not just Kabbalah, but I would say a lot of it also springs out of Gnosticism as well. Would you agree with that, Robert?
Well, Gnosticism came later, quite a bit later in the whole history. As the Egyptian government fell to Roman rule and things started to split up, then the Gnostics took up some of the banners of alchemy, a lot of the philosophical ideas, and they perpetuated it in times when Roman rule was trying to crush it out. Alchemy's been through a number of periods where the powers that be, the government, tried to crush it out of existence.
Why do you think that is? Do you think, obviously were they threatened because they didn't want someone to make a ton of gold and devalue the currency, or do you think it's more of a spiritual control type paradigm that they're afraid of?
Well, both at different times. Initially, like you mentioned, debasing the currency became a problem, especially in later Roman society. In fact, it was banned around about 290 A.D. Emperor Diocletian, called for the destruction of all the works dealing with alchemy. He wanted to readjust the currency of the empire and getting rid of people who could manipulate metals and create artificial metals that looked like gold or silver. He was afraid of that debasing the currency even further, and tried to put a stop to it by destroying any written works dealing with it. Chased all the teachers of alchemy out of the country, pretty much. They all fled into what was known as the Arabias at that time, and that began the whole trend of, or the whole period of Arabic alchemy, and that became popular later, around 700, 800 AD. You know, the whole alchemical world shifted into the Arabias.
And that's how we get the word alchemy, right? Because chemic or chemi or chemet is for Egypt, and then the al comes from the Arabic article or whatever.
Right. Yeah, Egypt was known as chem or chemet, and these sciences, as they moved into Greek society, became known as chemia, the Egyptian art or the black art. Chem meant black, you know, in reference to the soil deposited each year by the Nile flooding. So Egypt became known as the Black Land, or chemia, or chem, and these sciences became known as chemia, the original black arts. Later on, under Arabic rule, chemia became known as alchemia, and later Latinized into alchemy.
So is that why some of the writings are so dense and so allegorical, and it seems like a lot of the actual practices are encoded in symbolism? And would you say that was to protect it from the powers that be, or just to kind of hide the secrets from the profane?
Both. You know, the church was under control of the information. You know, it's around at 1000 AD. You know, there were Muslim conquests going on all across northern Africa. They swept up into Spain, and Spain became a center of Arabic culture, you know, for several centuries. And they brought with them all these texts which were in Arabic, but they were the ancient texts like Aristotle and Plato's writings. And initially, Western Europe thought they were all Arabic origin writings. It was only later found out that these were preserved from destruction under Roman rule by the Arabs, who translated them into their own language. And, you know, if it wasn't for that, they probably would have been lost to the world.
And isn't it true when they first started deciphering the text, they put precedence on the alchemical works rather than Ptolemy's works?
Yeah, and they became very popular. And the church, you know, like I mentioned, they had their thumb on what knowledge was distributed to people. Churches were the main source for texts being, you know, translated and written down, because it all had to be done by hand. So they selected what texts people could get a hold of, and a lot of the texts were considered pagan and heathen writings. Even Aristotle and Plato's writings were considered, you know, pagans, and the church looked at them initially with great suspicion. So these texts, a lot of them had to be changed, altered, Christianized, you know, at least put under a guise of Christianity in order to have them published even, but also to avoid persecution by the church.
And that's why we have the term gibberish, right?
That's right. One of
Gibber.
the the Arabic authors, Jabir ibn Hayyan, he began a trend of writing texts in a coded language. You would read his text and wonder what he's talking about, and from his name, Jabir, we get our name gibberish.
It's quite an irony there. Is that kind of coded writing related at all to the language of the birds?
Not. That's something else, really, something different. Language of the birds was supposed to be an original language, the language of nature, and sort of a universal.
But I thought it was used in a coded way, is the kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, that was the idea behind it.
Doesn't Fulcanelli, I think, refer to some of the language of the birds being encoded into alchemy? It's basically you say one thing and it sort of means another, right?
Yeah, code words.
Right.
But a lot of people have thought that they're all psychological terms, and there are those who consider that there never was an alchemical laboratory tradition.
I guess that's a problem when things are so so symbolic, is that, at the end of the day, it can mean all things to all people, right?
That's right. And a lot of the technology has faded away, just because people have taken up a psychological interpretation of texts, that the original meaning of the chemical operations have become obscured, clouded, or forgotten. And so a lot of people have the idea that alchemy is purely a psychological metaphor and that there is no actual physical laboratory work done, which isn't true at all.
I think we have your books to to contemplate. They have quite a bit of detail in them about ancient alchemists and what they had to say about different materials and how they could be used, and I guess in more modern time, well, it's not exactly modern, but Paracelsus kind of bringing us into modern pharmacology, I guess you might say.
Yeah, Paracelsus shifted the whole thing. When alchemical texts first began being translated into Latin, the first text came out in 1144, and it began a trend that swept through Europe. People everywhere had heard about the wonders of alchemy, the possibility of transmuting cheap metals into gold and silver. And so it really started a trend where everyone wanted to try that out and try to become successful in that work. And it became very popular and actually became a problem because a lot of people were saying that they knew how to do it, but ended up just ripping customers off, basically. Saying, for a small fund or a small fee, I can teach you how to make gold, and they would get their payment and then disappear in the night. So alchemy started to get a really bad name. And by around 1310, the church tried to put a stop to it, and there were several countries that banned the practice of alchemy, under penalty of death. So there again, alchemy gets squashed down by the powers that be.
Well, I've only heard one instance of gold being fabricated in the presence of a king or something like that, but I noticed in your book, you say around 800 CE, and in 1310, Pope John the 12th or 22nd issued a decree prohibiting the practice, specifically to those who traded in alchemical gold. And then you got 1404, King Henry issued an act declaring gold making a crime. It seems like it was more real than people realize.
Yeah. You don't usually ban something that doesn't happen. You know what I mean?
Well, they've even transmuted gold in the modern times, but it's my understanding is that it's what's called a high energy transmutation. I think they had to bombard it with radiation or something to that effect to make another atom bind to it. Again, I don't have a real scientific background, so that just goes to show you it's possible. The question is, could it be done in a low energy situation, right?
Right.
And in addition to that, in addition to that, lately, a big thing in the scientific world is a discussion of what had been cold fusion, and they're now talking about essentially low energy nuclear.
Right.
And so, at least as it seems with current tests, they're getting a great deal of energy out of transmutation. There's an Italian guy named Andrea Rossi, who lives in Miami, who's got essentially an engine, And if you think about that, that's what he's doing, is he's transmutating metals.
Yeah.
And the trick is some kind of catalyst, apparently. But if we're this close, I mean, we have top scientists saying that his material, his methodology works, then you have to think that, transmutation is definitely possible in a low energy environment.
Yeah, and also the French biochemist Louis Kervran, he introduced the idea of biological transmutations, where biological systems could transmute one atom into a different atom within the body, and he was quite successful at it and proposed certain mechanisms. It was sufficiently well documented that the U.S. military took it over as a project to try and use the technology to develop a new type of energy, a new type of battery system using biological transmutation of elements. And this wasn't that long ago. This was in the 70s and 80s. The military confirmed the transmutation of elements, and they even proposed several mechanisms of how it was possible for a living system to do that. But like you mentioned, it really centers around some kind of a catalytic action or enzymatic action.
And is it one of the tests of those, a fertilized egg at the very beginning of gestation is much different just before hatching, as far as the chemical or the different atomic structure and consistency of what's in the egg?
Yeah. The initial experiments were concerned with chickens. Chickens were fed a special diet that was calcium-free, and yet they were still able to lay viable eggs, and in such a quantity that, robbing calcium from their bones just wasn't an option. It wasn't even possible, because the chicken would have soon been boneless, with the number of eggs it produced without calcium, if it had, robbed the calcium from its own bones to make the shells. But the discovery was that it was transmuting silicon into calcium within its own body. So the chicken would pick out little flecks of mica, which were a silicon-based mineral, and transmute that in its own body into calcium. Not quite not quite lead into gold, but along the same lines.
So we need a new kind of chicken.
Right. The ones that lay the golden eggs.
The black
Exactly.
bullet.
That's what they're probably working on that in the secret labs right now.
So I guess the ultimate goal of alchemy is to perfect nature. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that gets back to the ancient ideas of the philosophy. Aristotle, pretty much, the works of Aristotle really were at the forefront of alchemical works for centuries. And one of Aristotle's, or ancient Greek philosophical ideas was that all of nature comes from one source, and that everything is moving towards a greater state of perfection. And the alchemical works were really designed to prove these theories. So Greek theory had developed, and then it met along with Egyptian technology. The Egyptians were very adept at manipulating materials. You know, as we can see from their works of art today, they were very skillful at manipulating metals and stone.
Not only that, but some of the hieroglyphs show what appear to be Egyptians holding a filament inside a light bulb.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of their technology we can't duplicate today. I mean, look at the pyramids. They're still trying to figure out how they did that. So the idea was that the Egyptians had this great skill in manipulating metals. They could apply it towards Greek philosophy to prove theories. And so theory and practice kind of went hand in hand all along alchemical's history. And the idea that matter could be perfected was one of the ideas. And in the Arabic period, the whole idea of an elixir or a medicine that could be applied to metals developed. And the idea was that metals all want to become gold. They're all striving to become gold, but they have certain diseases, and that's why they corrode. So alchemy was about finding medicines which could cure metals of their diseases and allow them to reach their predestined perfection of gold or silver.
A lot of the texts too refer to something called the first matter, or the prima materia. Do you have any? Maybe you know and you don't want to say, but do you have any idea what that would refer to? Or I guess it would depend on what your outlook of what alchemy is, whether it be a physical science or a spiritual science. But what are your thoughts on the prima materia?
Well, there again we get back to Aristotle's ideas on matter. What is matter? And that there's only one source. Ultimately, all of this that's around us is one thing, and it's an adaptation of this one material, which is the prima materia. The prima materia was considered to be like an ocean of everything in potential. It's everywhere around us, and it's matter before actuality. So it's right all around us, like the alchemists say. It's everywhere present, and it doesn't become something until it is impressed with form. And this was known as a substantial form. So prima materia, which is like this ocean of potential, becomes impressed with a substantial form, and the elements all dissolved in this prima materia, the four elements, rally themselves around this substantial form and create whatever it is that it's supposed to be. So the substantial form, from which we get our word substance, is really the key factor. It's like spirit impresses form or impresses matter, and it becomes what it is destined to be.
Would that be consistent with theories or the etheric theory, and then consciousness acts on the ether to create substance?
Exactly, yeah. And these forms were said to come from the mind of the Creator, the divine mind. So out of the mind of Nous, or the Creator, came substantial forms which were impressed upon this ocean of prima materia, and then the forms would develop and become concrete. Prima materia it's everything in potential. Nothing takes precedence over anything else, so you don't really even see it. It doesn't really even exist until it is impressed with form. So the
Okay.
matter aspect is very subtle and diffuse and really not detectable until it becomes something. And it can't become something until it is impressed with form. And so really the idea of transmuting metals gets to the idea of killing the form of something and introducing a new substantial form.
That's much more metaphysical than I had anticipated. I was just
the idea
thinking
of why things would be reduced to their first matter. So, one of the first steps the alchemist said that you'd have to reduce a material to its first matter. And once you do that, then you would impress it with the form, the substantial form of gold, and then it would naturally develop into gold. So the idea was that reduce it first into its first matter, and then plant the seed that you want to grow. And the first matter then would rally around this substantial form and become gold.
so it's almost like an essence or something.
Right. But,
Okay.
but like you said, it's spirit impressing matter. And the terms became, hidden in alchemical text. So the masculine portion is always that spirit, the substantial form, and then the matter aspect is always the feminine. So you have the god and the goddess, or the king and the queen, the sun and the moon, any form of this dual nature, the male and the female, usually centers around that idea of the substantial form and the matter, or spirit and matter, and that interaction, which becomes whatever it is, destined to be.
And is that where the operator comes into play? In your foreword to your book says alchemy is said to be physical or spiritual, but in fact it's both. Can you talk about how the operator affects the laboratory experiments to make it more than just a chemical conversion?
Well, today, we in quantum mechanics, they talk about the importance of, the observer. The presence of an observer can change the whole outcome of an experiment in quantum level physics. So the mind actually impresses matter. But from ancient times, the idea was that there's not only a continuum of matter from the smallest particles to the largest, and a continuum of energy from the slightest impulse to forces that are pushing galaxies around, but also a continuum of consciousness and intelligence. So the ancients saw a whole hierarchy of intelligence, not just in the animal realm, but plants and minerals, everything possessed consciousness of some degree or some order. Today, we don't really think of minerals being alive, but to the alchemists, everything is alive. It has consciousness or intelligence of some degree. It has energy, and it has body. And these three became known as the three essentials: body, soul, and spirit, or the alchemist salt, sulfur, and mercury.
And is that what Frater Albertus might have been doing when he says that everything is about raising the vibratory rate? Was he resonating himself with his experiments?
Yeah. Everything is, like I say, it's moving towards a greater state of perfection, and that involves a greater vibratory quality. As things become higher energy, higher vibratory rate, they become more spiritualized. And the whole process of alchemy is spiritualizing materials, taking them from a crude state and bringing them closer towards the perfection that they're striving to become.
And meditating on it while you practice.
Right. The influence of your thoughts can have a dramatic effect on the materials you're working with. It's like anything else. If you have a house pet and you pay it lots of attention and it grows healthy and well, if you have a house pet and you neglect it and don't think about it too much, it shows. The animal is poor health, it's weak, it's afraid. Same with these works. The more attention you pay to them, the more they come around and are influenced by your intelligence. And pretty soon the two intelligences can, in a sense, sympathize with each other.
So in other words, you become gold when it becomes gold.
Exactly. And Paracelsus says that, he says you'll transmute nothing until you've transmuted yourself.
Right. And
So,
I have a little question about the four elements. First, I remember once you said something about you had some water. I guess you had a lab in Idaho or somewhere where it was cold in the winter.
all right.
And you left different types of water.
Yeah. Well, that's
Could you?
Yeah, that's an experiment with water. You can do a whole alchemical experiment with nothing but rainwater to demonstrate alchemical principles. And this operation, I used rainwater. I was living in Idaho, up in the central part, right on the edge of the primitive area, up in the mountains. And the initial part, you go out and you collect rainwater, and it can't touch the ground because that will discharge it. So it's very important how you collect the rainwater. Once the water is collected, you allow it to ferment, and that's a big key in alchemical processes. Is that they always begin with an initial fermentation or a putrefaction, and that's the substance being reduced into its first matter. So here again, we're back to that idea of the first matter. So the rainwater is a complete substance, and during its putrefaction or fermentation, it falls apart, and all its component pieces are reduced back into the rain's first matter, or its chaos. So you wouldn't think that you can ferment rainwater, but it does get slimy and scummy during the fermentation. And once you have it fermented, now you put it into a distillation train, and you gently distill out, you distill the rainwater into 4 fractions. So we'll say we have a liter of water, and we divide that into quarter-liter fractions. So we have the first thing that we'll distill out is the most volatile, which is the fire element. So we have the fire of water distill out first. And following that will be the next most dense element, which is air. So we have the air of water distilling out. And then we have the water of water distilling out, and what remains is the earth of water. So we have these 4 fractions, and I did this in Idaho, and this was back in the 70s. And I had all 4 fractions sitting on the desk in identical flasks, and I had to leave for a few days, during which time the temperature dropped to 20 below. There's 8 feet of snow outside and just freezing. It's the middle of winter. So I get back to the lab a few days later, and I'm kind of anxious because winters like that can really wreak havoc on your laboratory equipment. So I go into the lab, and here it is. It's 20 below. I can still see my breath. I'm breathing, and it's practically falling on the ground in a mist. 20 below in the lab. I look at my flasks, and here the fire of water is still liquid, and it has now a golden color. Right next to that is the flask of the air of water, and it blew the flask up and was totally white. And I looked at it under a magnifier, and it was white because the air of water was just shot full of little air bubbles. So the flask was totally shattered by this white ice just peppered with air bubbles, and that was the air of water. Next to that was the water of water, still totally liquid and clear. Next to that was the earth of water, totally solid, didn't break the flask, but was a clear, totally clear chunk of ice, no bubbles, no nothing, just a clear chunk of ice. So you would think, you'd ask a chemist, and he'd say, well, you have distilled water, distilled water, distilled water, and distilled water. But they have totally different qualities and characters. And I've seen this more than one occasion. It wasn't just a fluke or a freak accident. So I have done some work on that. Subsequent to that, I had some equipment where I could do some thermal analysis called a scanning calorimeter, and I could actually document that the different fractions have widely different freezing points and characteristics of heat flow.
Would that water have, I guess you'd say, other uses for people? I mean, could you use the fire water for something? I mean, I don't know. I mean, like health purposes or for gardening, things like that. Is there a way of, or are there people doing that?
Yes, and you can actually further divide those 4 into 3 each. So you would have the salt, sulfur, and mercury of the fire of water, and the salt, sulfur, and mercury of the air of water, and water of water, earth of earth. So you would end up with 12 fractions, actually, of your water. And each one has its own qualities. They're all a little bit different, and they can be used medicinally as a medicine in its own right, or as a carrier, like a carrier for another medicine, a vehicle. So if you were to, say, want to specifically target a specific organ or an organ system, you could select a fraction of the water which is harmonious to that. Each of these 12 fractions naturally falls in line with one of the 12 zodiac signs. And so there are astrological correspondences for each of these 12 water fractions, and thus they are assignable to a different body function or a different organ system based on their astrological association.
Fascinating.
Now, could any of this be a result of the changing the bonding angle of the water molecule? I've heard of different operations, vortexing and other things that can make water wetter, if you will, which absorbs into your cells more readily. Is that essentially what we're doing, is separating different size water crystal clusters?
That's a possibility. There are actually 33 different types of water molecules, since oxygen has a number of isotopes and hydrogen has a number of natural isotopes. The combination of the two can come together in 33 different forms. They're all H2O, but here this hydrogen is actually deuterium, heavy water hydrogen. So, with the number of isotopes that are natural for oxygen and the 3 natural isotopes of hydrogen, those can come together in 33 different combinations. So it's not a simple matter of saying it's H2O, but, there are isotope differences between 33 different molecules of water. So it's possible that you get some separation on that level as well.
I've heard
with heavy water, they would go down to very deep lakes and get the bottom water, and then refine that to get the deuterium.
I've also heard quite a few alchemists are fond of using dew, and perhaps in May for some reason. Why would the time of year matter for that?
May dew is it's a code word also for the philosophical mercury or the spirit, but there are experiments using dew, and it's collected in the springtime because the natural tendency of nature, everything is springing to life. So the dew and rainwater during that time is particularly filled with the life force. And that's something that the alchemist tries to isolate, that living force, the life
Chi
force.
or prana, I guess you'd call it.
Prana or chi, exactly. It's more concentrated during that time. That's why things spring out of the ground. That's why they call it spring. Everything is just being saturated with this vital energy, and that's something that the alchemists seek to capture.
Have you done any thing along the lines of what Professor Emoto in Japan has done with, frozen water and seeing what the crystals look like?
I have to some degree, not just with water, but other materials too. And yeah, Professor Emoto's work he was looking at the influence of thought. We talked about that a little earlier. The influence of mind on matter. And his series of works were to take water and, intensely concentrate on the water with certain emotions. So, say he would take the emotion of love, and he would just beam love at this water, and as it froze, so he would freeze it, and it would be subjected to his intense concentration on the emotion of love, beaming at the water as it froze, and it changed how the water froze. If he took the same water and then beamed hateful thoughts at it, it would get this totally different pattern of how it froze. Very disruptive, very chaotic, really ugly. Whereas, thinking thoughts of love towards it, it grew into this, beautiful pattern. So he did a series of experiments like that, of beaming different types of emotion and thought on water as it was freezing, and was able to document that the mind really does cause influences which are observable.
Did you do anything kind of related to that?
Just in a general way, nothing like freezing it like he did. It's more of a general trend towards alchemical works.
Does anybody use, does anybody use, for example, music to, positive sounds or something like that?
Oh, yeah.
When doing alchemical work?
Yeah, there are people who play particular types of music, and this is not an early idea. In the 1600s, there was a text that came out, which was really the first multimedia text that came out. It had not only alchemical experiments, but there were musical pieces that went along with each of the different processes. And so there were woodcuts and text and musical pieces. So it was really the first multimedia package to come out in the 1600s. But they applied music, and I know of other alchemists who are into that aspect of using colored light and music, different types of sound or mantras to influence their works.
Yeah, I noticed on the website, I think it was as a result of the School of Paracelsus, the offshoot of that, on one of the links, they had different music for different operations, one for distilling, one for calcination, and you could play it while you did it. Something that I noticed that was very interesting, it says in your book that alchemy aims to produce medicines for the soul and spirit, and during certain operations, only the alchemist should be around, because of the negative thoughts around it, with other people can actually spoil the experiment, and at certain points only the operator handle the material. Can you tell us what those certain points would be? Is that during the distillation or when it's in liquid form?
Well, you have to become more and more careful as things become more purified. As you get a very purified material, you have to take precautions to keep it purified. Even, physical laboratory work today, they'll agree with that. I mean, if you have a very highly refined material, you have to take steps to prevent contamination. Even keeping it from exposure to the air or breathing on it or touching it in any way or touching certain materials. The alchemists go, a step further in that, your thoughts are touching this stuff too. And like a magnet, they can rub off on the material and cause changes, which, gets back to that Professor Emoto's work. Your thoughts do influence matter, and that as these things become more and more refined, they become more and more susceptible to thoughts around them. And so, if you're the alchemist and you have this thing that you've refined for months and months now, and you show it to somebody who scoffs at it and laughs at it and calls it, some derogatory names, and, it, in a sense, it hurts the feelings of the material, and it gets impressed with this and starts to warp it and change it. And so at this point, these are like sacred materials. The alchemists consider them evolved beings, and that they are living creatures, living medicines, and that they are susceptible to, not only external force, but internal mental force as well.
I've heard you in a previous interview discuss something called the homunculus. I was just wondering if you'd be able to briefly describe what that is, and if you have any experience creating it or, working with that.
Well, the homunculus was, again, an idea in alchemical thought, was that can man create life, basically? And this was an argument that went all through time, even from the time of Aristotle, is that can art really do better than nature, or can art just mimic nature? Can art go beyond what nature does? Can art produce a living form? And so, again, here's theory, and practice meeting up. So in practice, the preparation of a homunculus, which was supposed to be a small living human being, created in a laboratory, like a test tube baby, but created totally differently. Generally began with the fermentation of male sperm and its separation, and then it was later fed with an extract made from blood, human blood. So some of these experiments get kind of ghoulish, and that was one of them, one of the darker sides of alchemy. There are similar experiments. The water work we mentioned earlier, you can recombine the fractions of the water in certain combinations and create mineral forms or animal forms or plant forms, depending on how you put these fractions of water back together and digest it. And I have seen, from that experiment, I have seen plant forms on more than one occasion, and I have seen production of animal forms on 2 occasions. And I've had it confirmed with other workers I know of who basically got the same results I did. And the animal forms were like strange little 1-inch worms that had little feelers on both ends. And where they came from, I have no idea, because everything was closed and sealed, and the water fractions had been distilled, so they've been boiling for hours. And I tried to keep everything clean and sterile. So where plants or animal forms came from, I had no idea how to explain that other
It's
than
fascinating.
the alchemical theory.
And that was from just the different extractions of pure water, distilled water?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is explained in a work called The Golden Chain of Homer. It was published in about 1723. It was a very popular textbook of alchemy. In fact, if anyone out there is seriously interested in alchemical theory, The Golden Chain of Homer is really a time-honored textbook of the ABCs of alchemical theory and practice. It's very good. I highly recommend checking that one out.
What are your thoughts? Through history, there's been different alchemists that have been reputed to have achieved the Philosopher's Stone. I think the most famous is Nicholas Flamel. There's also tales of the Count de Saint-Germain. In your opinion, do you think any of these folks had actually achieved it?
I believe they have, yeah. I mean, there are cases all through time of people, really describing the same material. It's this heavy, glassy-looking material. It's crimson or saffron-colored when it's crushed, soluble in water or wine. And from faraway places, they describe the same thing, whether they're in Germany or Italy or Greece or England or even in India. India has a long history of alchemical works too, and there's a case of metallic transmutation in 1947 in a temple near New Delhi. They did a demonstration of transmutation of mercury into gold, and the master who performed it, or at least produced the material to perform it, had a material which he claimed was produced from metallic mercury. It was a red, heavy powder, just like the alchemists explain all through time. And there were about 30 witnesses, including state dignitaries and engineers, scientists, people witnesses. Transmutation. He took a small amount of this powder, and I think the total amount was about a kilogram of gold transmuted out of just a small amount of this red powder. And it was witnessed by all these people. In fact, they put a plaque inside the temple, a carved plaque, commemorating the whole event. It stands there today.
The other part of that equation is the Philosopher's Stone. I mean, doesn't just turn lead into gold. It's also reputed to grant physical immortality. Do you think that's realistic, or?
I'm not sure about the physical immortality. It is supposed to be curative for, most, if not all, diseases. It's supposed to be a universal cure for all human ailments. And I could see that. It's really imparting that intelligence into the body. The body is a self-healing, self-regulating mechanism, and if it has diseases or issues, it's because it's gotten out of balance. And if we supply the right information to the body can repair itself and heal itself. Cells can live for a very, very long time, practically immortal, if they have the right substances. The cells in our body come and go regularly, and so we keep this steady state of good cells being formed and not becoming degraded copies over time, because the elements and cosmic radiation, they cause changes in our physiology, in our structure. And if the body doesn't correct those, then we start to get old and cells degrade, and we get all the signs and symptoms of aging. But the Philosopher's Stone is said to be able to supply the body with intelligence such that it can maintain itself perpetually healthy and in a relatively young state. They don't say you'll be rejuvenated, but the accounts are that people who have taken it stay in a state. They seem to be around in their 40s maybe, but they never seem to age much beyond that.
Do you find any credibility to using dew from the human to produce a possible Philosopher's Stone?
It's quite possible, yeah. I have several versions of, basically the Book of Aquarius. That's not a new thing. The idea of using urine as a first material is actually fairly old. One case in point is the text called the Liquor Alkahest. It's written by Irenaeus Philaletes, and it shows up in the Collectanea Chemica. The alkahest was one of the alchemical goals, sort of a universal solvent. And this isn't, people think that, well, if it's a universal solvent, how can you contain it in anything? Won't it just eat the container? The solvency is that this solvent would extract the essentials from minerals or plants or animals. So it was universal in that respect. So it could be used to extract the essence of any subject from animal, mineral, or vegetable kingdom. Glass was a dead material, and it could contain it. But it again, derived from urine, use of urine. And the Book of Aquarius is all about that process. Although there are some points that aren't pointed out in the Book of Aquarius, beginning with an initial fermentation. According to the Book of Aquarius, you basically collect urine and you're good to go. Start distilling it, and you collect the volatile fraction and get down to salts and such. But initially, and the alchemically correct way is to first ferment the urine. So you collect the urine and allow it to ferment. And that fermentation, again, reduces it into its first matter, or its chaos. And then you start distilling out the elements.
That means I have to start all over? 18 months in, here we go. All right.
I did have a friend, and this was years ago, around 1980. He had 5 gallons of very fermented urine and began distilling it in his girlfriend's basement, and the flask broke. And he had 5 gallons of very fermented urine all over his girlfriend's cement floor. I don't think she ever forgave him for that.
I think
that's
there's
the other trick, right? You have to have your own lab.
I think there's a couple yoga texts too that actually recommend drinking your urine, and I think it specifies something like for 5,000 days straight, and you'll achieve immortality or something. Now, I don't know if they leave a whole bunch out of that equation, but I've read people that are trying that experiment too. So.
Oh yeah, I mean that's actually fairly popular in the Middle East and in India. It's called Shivambu. It's urine drinking. Anwar Sadat was a urine drinker. There are a number of state dignitaries in the Middle East who perform that. Urine is, when it comes out, it's sterile. It's filled with a kinds of nutrients. There are stories of people being buried, in earthquake rubble, and they had nothing to drink but their own urine. And when they were finally rescued, they came to the realization that long-standing medical problems were cured. People with arthritis suddenly had no more arthritis after having to drink their urine for a couple of days. So it definitely has healing qualities.
Actually,
and the
Robert,
idea that it could be perfected into a workable stone, which could transmute metals and also, cure human diseases.
well, Robert, I think one thing a lot of people are interested in is alchemy or alchemical processes for health.
Yeah.
Right? The elixirs and the spagyrics. Right? I mean, you can have a sun elixir for Sunday and then a moon elixir for Monday, that kind of thing, right?
Right. And Paracelsus started that whole trend, around 1500. Up until that point, alchemical processes were mainly aimed at perfecting metals, and the elixir or medicines were applied to metals to cure them of their corruptibility. And Paracelsus universalized the whole concept in that we could develop medicines for men just as we could do for metals. And so we could bring, humans to a state of greater perfection using these alchemical elixirs in a proper fashion. So, the health benefits now became most important, and the idea of making gold sort of faded off into the distance in favor of, superior medicines. But there again, we ran into more problems. In the 1600s, the charlatans and fakers came out of the woodwork on this as well, just like with the gold. They claimed to have all these curative elixirs, and many of them just turned out to be metallic poisons, and people started getting sick and dying. And again, the whole concept of alchemical works were thrown into a bad light. Alchemy got a further bad merits on its reputation, and people started to doubt the whole thing and look at the whole concept of alchemy suspiciously again.
Well, maybe you could give us a brief explanation of the idea of spagyrics, because I think some people aren't so familiar with that. I mean, you're capturing the essence of plants as they give up the ghost, right?
Right.
And then rebuilding it.
Right. You mentioned the alchemical idea that everything has a body, soul, and spirit, or what the alchemists called their salt, sulfur, and mercury, and that we can separate those into physical forms, physical analogs, so we could actually have a physical analog of the soul of a plant or the spirit of a plant or its actual essential body. And the word spagyrics actually derives from, and this is a word that Paracelsus made up. It's two Greek words, speo, meaning to separate, and agyron, meaning to draw together again. And so the idea of separation and putting things back together again, it's a take on the old solvent coagula of alchemical works, where you take a plant, for example. So we have this living creature out there. It's alive. It has intelligence of a degree. And we take this living plant and pull out its essential, what the alchemists called its sulfur. And this is the essence or the soul of the thing. And this is housed in the essential oil. So we take a plant and we distill out its essential oil. And, if you take that oil and you pass it around and people smell it and you say, oh, that's cinnamon or vanilla or whatever the plant is. You don't have to see the plant. You recognize the whole character and quality of the plant just by the oil. And so the alchemists considered this the real soul of the thing. The essence and character of the plant is housed in this essential oil. So the essential oil became known as the alchemical sulfur, or the soul of the plant. It's a vehicle that carries that soul essence of the plant. And now with the soul not pulled out of the plant, and in a sense it's knocked unconscious, the plant dies. The consciousness doesn't go back into the plant, and the plant dies, and it gives up the ghost, its spirit. And so the plant ferments naturally, and now we take this fermented mass and we distill it, and we get out the alcoholic, the volatile part. And in fact, today they sell vegetable spirits, and that's where the term comes from, the spirits. So the alchemists would distill out this alcoholic extract, and they termed that the spirit of the plant. And what was left was just the corpse, the dead body. And now we take these three substances, right? We have our essential oil. We refine it by distilling it. So we've done the first part, right? We've done the separation. We've separated out the oil and the volatile alcohol, which is the mercury or the life force, and we have this dead body left over. So we've done that first part, the separation. Now the second part of spagyrics calls for purification. So we take now our distilled oil and we redistill it to become really refined. We take our alcohol and we redistill that, and it becomes very potentized. And we take our dead body and we burn it. We calcine it or cremate it to get down to its essential salts. And we can pull out a white crystalline salt from the plant material, and this was considered the purified essential body of the plant. And now we take this purified body and we reintroduce its consciousness, the soul or the oil, into the body, and we reanimate it, wake it up with the spirit or the alcohol portion. And so in a sort of a resurrection, the consciousness and spirit are placed back into the purified body, and the alchemists considered these resurrected beings. They carry now a signature like a Christed consciousness. They've gone through death and resurrection, and now they are evolved beings. They called them a glorified corpus in ancient times. So here we have now a being which has become evolved or elevated to a spiritual level, and it can impart that spiritual consciousness into us in a medicinal fashion. So they're very powerful, very penetrating medicines which can address issues that modern medicine is having difficulties with today. There are many claims of curing things like cancer and leprosy, gout, various heart problems, lung problems, even eye, brain, lung problems, things that modern medicine is still struggling with. There are numerous claims of curative effects, not just bringing relief, but actually curing cancers and leprosy. And those claims go way back through time.
Well, my experience is that well-prepared spagyrics seem to work a lot better than the kind of lifeless plants or herbal extracts that you find in, for example, health food store.
Yeah. And
I mean, echinacea. I mean, they do it in an industrial scale, and I don't think they have their heart in it, really.
Right. Yeah. The extracts you usually buy in stores, health food stores, they go out and they take a plant and they will extract it with usually an alcohol water mixture for 1 or 2 days, and then they squeeze out the juice, and they take the herb that's extracted and they throw that in the dumpster. So right there, they've thrown away one of the essential materials. According to alchemical theory, they've thrown away the body, and what they have now is this spirit extract. It's a ghost, basically. It's the soul and spirit, but it has no body. And that body really changes the whole nature of the spagyric tincture, because it changes the electrical quality of the tincture. So in spagyrics, we take our oil and the alcohol and the salt, and they're all put back together. In the ones you buy in the store, they have just part of the oil and part of the alcohol. The body is gone, and when you take that, as soon as it hits your tongue, your body says, what is this stuff, and it sends it down to your stomach to be digested. And in digestion, it gets broken apart, and many of the healing molecules are broken apart. And so you lose a good portion of its healing potential just in digestion. In the spagyric, because we have added the minerals back in, the whole electrical quality of the tincture is now changed. And once it hits your tongue, your body says, oh, this is digested material, and it's good to go. It's already going into your system through your tongue. There's no digestion required, and so no breakdown of the essential components. They're already racing into your bloodstream. So, there's a big difference there in the quality and the effectiveness between a spagyric and a standard tincture, such as the pharmacopoeias today would, have out there.
Now, you also do things like harvest plants astrologically, right?
Yeah, you can do whole works based on astrological influence.
Well, I mean, if, for example, some plant is for a health problem, a weak liver or something like that, then you might want to choose a plant that's noted for helping with the liver, and then you might want to harvest it at a time that would seem to be astrologically based on that, right?
Right. And so for liver, the alchemist would select an herb or mineral ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter is said to have an affinity or a resonance with the liver. I mean, they both have an underlying vibration or energetic signature, which is compatible. And so that's the whole thing with astrological correspondences, is that things are related which don't seem to be related. So your liver and the planet Jupiter have a correspondence. They have a similar vibratory quality, and that relates to a number of different plants, say like the plant lemon balm or melissa, that's ruled by Jupiter. The metal tin is ruled by Jupiter. Various stones, and there are a number of plants which are ruled by Jupiter, and any of those could be used as a medicine to affect the liver in various ways.
You mentioned the 7 basics in your book for plant stones, but I never came across the list of 7. Can you explain what those would be? I guess it's the 7 basic herbs.
Well, there's no set particular herbs. Like we were just talking about, the planets rule a number of different herbs and minerals and metals. So the planet Venus, for example, rules, a number of different herbs, all the mints, lavender. Actually, lavender's under Mercury. Each planet has a whole list of herbs that are compatible, or they resonate with the Venus ray, if you will.
Okay, I guess I misunderstood. I was expecting them to be herbs, but you're talking about, I guess, in the astrology portion of the book, the 7 basics corresponding to the planets.
Right.
Which ones respond best to the moon?
Moon? The moon has a number of herbs. Watercress is a good one. Aloe vera is often placed under the moon. Lettuce is under the moon. Wild lettuce, cleavers. There are a number of lunar herbs, and what you would do for the 7 basics is to select one herb ruled by the moon, select one herb ruled by Mars, select one herb ruled by, Mercury, one by Jupiter, one by Saturn, one by the Sun. So you have 7 different herbs, and you make an extract, a spagyric, from each of these 7. So you'll end up with 7 elixirs, one for each day of the week. Our days of the week are named after the planets. So Sunday is ruled by the sun, and you would take your spagyric, which is made from a solar plant, and you would take that on Sundays. Mondays, you would take your moon-ruled plant, elixir. Tuesdays, you would take your Mars-ruled plant, and Wednesdays, you would take Mercury. Jupiter is on Thursday. Friday would be Venus. Saturday would be Saturn. And so each day, you would take a different elixir, and that would address health issues with different organ systems. So, the sun rules the heart and the eyes, and so any heart problems or conditions would be addressed on Sunday with your sun elixir. The moon rules the brain, and so any kind of problems with cerebral matter would be addressed by the moon on Mondays. Tuesday is Mars, that rules the gallbladder and also the arterial circulation of the blood. Those would be problems addressed by your Mars elixir on Tuesdays, and so on. Each organ system would receive a boost of energy on its particular day. And so these 7 basics go through and start mobilizing toxins in the various organ systems, and they start flushing things out of all the fine channels that connect the various organ systems. And so, it's not a matter of being a doctor or having a great deal of medical knowledge. I mean, you can take these herbs, and they're all, inherently safe, but you take one elixir for each day, and it addresses each organ system one by one. And so it'll go through and flush out your kidneys, it'll flush out your liver, flush out the gallbladder and bloodstream, address any problems with the heart or the brain. Each one day by day would do its thing and slowly mobilize the toxins out of the body. And these things being spiritualized, these elixirs become incorporated into you. And so you really are what you eat. And so these spiritualized substances slowly, over time, become incorporated into your actual cellular structure. And so you are spiritualizing yourself by taking these spiritualized medicines. They become incorporated into you and cause changes, physical and mental changes. So it's a very wide sweeping medicinal systems possible.
How would somebody go about doing that? Are there products on the market? Would we have to make these things ourselves? How would we do that?
Well, ideally, you would make them yourself, because there are things that happen in the laboratory. When you're working on materials, you go through changes yourself, and that's part of the whole alchemical experience. Is that theory is one thing, but practice brings the theory to reality. And things you may not even consider will pop up into your mind, almost like revelations during the actual operations of laboratory alchemy. and you'll actually see and handle these materials, and as a result, they cause you to have certain revelations, and things become much more clear, and the texts start to become self-explanatory. Things that were obscure before are crystal clear now that you've actually experienced and you've seen these things.
I think Adam McLean refers to that as sort of like an alchemical mandala, right?
Yeah. Yeah, in a sense, these things are working on you as you're working on them. But, you know, if you can't make them yourself, they are easy to make. I mean, I've seen 10-year-olds make their own spagyric elixirs. I mean, it's not that hard to do. And there are plenty of materials online or, you know, in my own book that tell you how to make a simple spagyric. And it's the easiest thing to do as far as alchemical works, and really is the gateway to further, more advanced alchemical works.
I did get excited while reading your book. I was eyeing my garden, getting ready to do some, and then I read a passage. It takes about 10 pounds to do a successful stone. Is that true? I don't think I have 10 pounds of rosemary out back.
Yeah, well, it depends. You know, you're going to do a lot of work to make a stone, and so you want to have something substantial when you're done with it. 10 pounds is kind of an overall catch. You could use less. I've used as little as 4 or 5 ounces of an herb to make a stone, but it's very small. You know, you could certainly go out and harvest your garden for a few ounces of rosemary and make a very powerful spagyric. You wouldn't have to push it all the way to making the vegetable stone. That's kind of a special topic all on its own. But the spagyric elixir, you could use a much smaller amount. You buy 1 ounce of an herb and make a spagyric that will last you most of the year.
Are there any specific herbs you would recommend for the beginner?
I would choose herbs that are safe and easy, like rosemary you mentioned. That's a good sun herb, so I would use that as my Sunday elixir. Watercress is a good moon herb. You could use that. Stinging nettle, that's a good Mars herb. It grows everywhere. That's a good herb for Mars. But I would use herbs which are, you know, we use them in spices, culinary herbs. You know, dill or fennel maybe for Mercury. Dandelions for Jupiter. Any of the mints for Venus. There's a plant called horsetail, ruled by Saturn. That's a good one. Alfalfa is another Saturn-ruled herb that's safe to use.
Has
Saturn
anybody
herbs
done?
You got to be careful with. A lot of Saturn herbs are poisonous, so you have to be careful. The two I mentioned, alfalfa and horsetail, are safe to use.
Has anybody done work with mushrooms?
There are a number of people doing work with mushrooms. I don't work too much with them personally. They're difficult to identify. You have to be quite expert at identifying mushrooms, or you can easily run into trouble. But there are a number of operators I know who are interested in mushrooms and lichens, various types of moss and that type of material.
Are you at all familiar with the work of Clark Heinrich?
It doesn't ring a bell, no.
The gist of his research is that the flyageric essentially is the first step towards the philosopher's stone. I don't know if you're...
That's actually an old idea. The Amanita...
Muscaria.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all along the same line. Some have claimed them to be the soma, the ancient Indian technology, being an elixir of immortality also. mushrooms are dangerous to work with, and unless you know what you're doing, you have to be really careful with mushrooms, especially the agaric family of mushrooms, the Amanita muscaria, and Amanita pantherina, the death angel. I would definitely do those in very small amounts.
Around my part, the shiitake mushroom is touted to be medicinal, and it's all over the place. I was wondering if it'd be worth the while trying something with that family of mushrooms.
That would be interesting. I have done some work with mushrooms that I know what they are. They've been identified for me, so I wouldn't go out and try and collect mushrooms myself. I can identify a few, but there's so many out there that I don't know that it's easy to get very sick using mushrooms. But they are very powerful. I can attest to that.
Well, another topic is the metallic oils, right? There's a lot of health benefits from them too, right?
Right. And that's the technology that was nearly lost. We've seen alchemy go through these periods of being suppressed by the powers in control, and a lot of the ideas behind how to process minerals and metals into medicinal agents were suppressed. During that period where quacks and charlatans came out of the woodwork and selling these metallic oils, but they were really just poisons because they didn't follow the true alchemical methods. In fact, the term quack comes from quacksalvers. They would take quicksilver and turn it into this medicinal agent, supposedly, which was actually poison, and it would kill people, and so they became known as quicksalvers or quacks. So that's where it comes from.
Are there any metallic oils that are kind of easy to get started with, or that people should look into?
Metals, they're a difficult area. If you don't know what you're doing, you can definitely run into some toxicology issues, especially with some of the heavier metals. Things like iron. Iron probably is the safest of the metals. But there are minerals that you can use, like calcium from shells or bones. There are preparations from bird feathers, even. And so these are minerals that are derived from animal sources. And so in a sense, they're adjusted towards animal physiology, and they're quite a bit safer to operate with initially than jumping into the heavier metals like lead and even gold or silver or antimony. Antimony is very poisonous. If you don't know how to use that, then you're basically working with arsenic, and you can easily kill yourself. So in alchemy, in the practical laboratory sense, we always start off working with herbs because they're friendly. We're used to using herbs in our diet. They're much more forgiving of mistakes in the laboratory. If you break a flask full of an herb extract, it's not a big deal. If you've got some antimony preparation in a certain state and it breaks, then if you've got some issues, you may have to evacuate the area and do some serious environmental cleanup. So metals can, cause you some serious hurt if you're not prepared to deal with those. And you learn how to do that by working with herbs first. And you may work with herbs for several years before you even touch mineral or metallic preparations. A lot of people are anxious to just jump right in and do some, metallic alchemy, because that's where the real powerful medicines are, and they bypass the whole herbal realm and the whole experience of getting your sea legs, in the laboratory by working with herbs for some time. They really prepare you for working with the more dangerous and more advanced works. So I always highly recommend, working with herbs first, and getting familiar with laboratory operations and manipulations, because everything you do and apply towards herbal alchemy, you will apply it towards mineral alchemy. They just take longer times and hotter temperatures, a little bit more potent solvents, but the manipulations and ideas are all the same. So, I always recommend use the herbs first, play with the herbs until you're familiar and comfortable working in the lab, and then move on to the more serious metallic preparations.
Are you at all familiar with some of the Eastern alchemy practices, like that the Taoist would use as far as internal alchemy?
Yeah, to some degree. I know of the Taoist meditations, circulating energy, and the microcosmic orbit. It's in Chinese or Taoist alchemy, your own fluids become the base materials for the elixir. So in one of the processes of Taoist alchemy, you hold a posture for a certain time with your tongue pressed against the roof of your mouth until your mouth is like entirely filled with saliva, and you're about to spit out saliva. It's so full, and then you swallow that in one big gulp, and then you do some breathing techniques, which basically that saliva goes down into the cauldron inside your stomach, and then you do some breathing techniques to adjust the temperature and acidity, alkalinity of the bloodstream, and you're basically cooking the saliva into an elixir, and then you circulate that energy by a process of meditation, of breathing and concentration of the energy, of circulating it around the body and in what's called the microcosmic orbit. Indian alchemy, India also has a very long history of alchemy, and in fact, many of their preparations are receiving attention by the medical profession today. They produce metallic elixirs, which they call basmas, and these are like a metallic ash, very finely divided, almost at the atomic level. These powders are so fine. They take quite a long time of processing, but they use very simple methods and materials. I like Indian alchemy because of that. They're really what I call guerrilla alchemy. They're really expert at that. They can use simple materials to do complex processes and make very powerful medicines. And like I say, today the medical association is seriously looking at some of these materials because they're having effects. For example, a zinc basma, and this is a zinc metal that has been processed into a very fine, kind of a golden yellow powder, and it's having very powerful effects on people with diabetes, and they're proving this in the clinical trials. There's no reason for it. Zinc and diabetes, there's no real connection, but they're finding that it's true. I mean, the Indian alchemists have prescribed zinc basma as a specific for diabetes for several centuries, and today modern medicine is looking into that and finding that, hey, yeah, this does work. It's having some influence. So I've seen that myself firsthand. Zinc basma having definite effects on someone with diabetes.
Yeah, I know. My girlfriend traveled to India for a wedding, and her nephew got sick, and they tried some of the conventional medicine, and it didn't help him at all. And then they went to one of the doctors who gave him an Ayurvedic formula, and within an hour he was fine.
Yeah, and there again, the powers that be almost stamped out Indian alchemy there was a very long tradition, at least as old as Western alchemy. And in fact, during that Arabic period, there was commerce between India and China and the Arabic world, and a lot of the ideas crisscrossed. And you can, if you know Indian alchemy, which is a part of Ayurveda, which is the Indian medical system. If you're familiar with Ayurveda, you'll see that Western alchemy is loaded with the same ideas and concepts. And so there was definitely cross-pollination, between the cultures along alchemical lines. A lot of the Western technology mirrors that of the Indian alchemists.
While we're on the subject of metals, and I hate to go out in left field, but I don't know who else to ask but you. I'm afraid to collect dew because of chemtrails and the poisonous stuff they seem to be putting on us. Is there any relation of aluminum, barium, and strontium to these alchemical practices in the metal realm?
Yeah, sure. I mean, everything has its medicinal qualities. Everything. So, calcium, barium, strontium, those are all, in the same period on the periodic table, and they share similar qualities, mostly under Saturn. Calcium is a mineral said to be ruled by Saturn, and Saturn, as a ruler of metals, rules the metal lead. But even in India, they recognize Saturn as the ruler of calcium, and calcium is the main constituent in bones. In both systems, East and West, relate Saturn to the skeletal structure. Aluminum is a little bit different quality. It's said to be under the rulership of the moon. And, aluminum is what the third most abundant element on the crust of the Earth. And we are associated very strongly with the moon. And so there are conjectures of using aluminum metallic tinctures to affect the brain, which is ruled by the moon. And there are ideas that things like Alzheimer's, dementia, those things could be affected by tinctures from aluminum, metallic tinctures. So they all have healing potentials. Even though aluminum has a bad reputation, I know. But alchemically, it's said to be under the rulership of the moon, just like silver.
Is there any concern for contaminated dew, collecting dew and using stuff in a heavily chemtrailed area?
Yeah, and in today's modern world, that's a serious problem. Even rainwater, there are some areas where the rainwater is so acidic it burns through, metal roofs, corrodes statues that have been standing for, years and years, and with the increasing quantities of pollution going into the air, these statues are starting to, reveal that, the rain is not so pure. I live here in the Pacific Northwest. It always rains, so the sky gets pretty much washed out, and I don't have to worry too much about it, But there are areas like, L.A. and heavily congested areas where it definitely becomes a problem. And in order to use it alchemically, you have to distill the whole lot. So, for example, the dew you mentioned, you could collect the dew, and then you'd have to immediately distill the whole thing, and then use that distilled dew for your process. So you would take the distilled dew or the rainwater and begin from that, so you ferment it. Instead of just collecting the rainwater and fermenting it,
right,
you would have to add that additional step of first distilling it all to get rid of the impurities, and then fermenting it, and then proceeding with the alchemical process.
I've also heard that water has memory to the point where you can dilute a tincture 1,000 times and it would still have the medicinal properties of the original, even though you couldn't find a trace of the original medicine in there. And wouldn't that also be true with contaminants?
To some degree, yeah. It depends how it's made. Water, if you look at a molecule of water, it's like a little bar magnet. It has a positive end and a negative end because of, the angle of the hydrogens, which are hooked onto the oxygen. The hydrogens have a positive charge, and they're kind of pushed onto one end of the oxygen. And so as a result, the oxygen has a negative charge, and the hydrogen has a positive charge. And so, in effect, you have these tiny little bar magnets, and when you put something in like a metal which has its own electrical field, all these little bar magnets line up around it in a certain order, and then they are broken off in a process called succussion, where you basically pound it onto a tabletop or something very hard, and the water molecules, which are now linked around this solid, get broken off in chains, and other molecules of water form themselves around these broken chains. And so that information that's stored in the chain of these little bar magnets of water gets impressed onto new molecules of water, and then they're broken off, and they spread the word to other molecules of water. And so eventually, in doing this dilution, there's no more of the metal actually in there, but the information that was encoded in these little bar magnets of water in chains has been propagated through the various series of dilutions. And that's very common in homeopathic preparations.
What about all the radiation in addition to the chemtrails in the Pacific, what about from Fukushima, all the radiation that's coming over? Have you been finding that in any of your rainwater or dew?
I haven't, but I haven't really. I don't really have equipment to, determine that with any accuracy. I'm sure.
Would it matter? I mean, would it come out in your processing?
It would come out. I don't think it would be anything too significant.
Have you heard of a technique? I'm not sure if it falls in line with traditional alchemy or not, but say, for instance, if you wanted to make a tonic or something to cure cancer, you would basically, for instance, dissolve the cells into a flask of water, and then you would essentially keep diluting that by half parts, and then after so many dilutions, apparently whatever was in the water originally would be totally purged, but by the halving and additioning of more water, you'd create a tonic. Have you heard of that method at all?
Not that one specifically, but it sounds similar to the homeopathic lines of propagating the information in the solvent. So the solvent actually is like a blank slate, and you impress it with a certain format or design, and then it's propagated throughout further dilutions. And so it's not so much the actual molecule even being present, it's just the signature or the information that's encoded now into the solvent that gets transferred from dilution to dilution. It's really a matter of intelligence that's being transferred.
And here we're talking about a cancerous cell, and how would that be medicinal if it were diluted, I wonder?
Well, each cell, has its own intelligence, and I'm not sure if the cancer intelligence would be propagated or the idea that something is wrong with the cell would be propagated, and how to repair that is actually propagated.
Yeah, my understanding is once you dilute it enough that the original material is no longer present, and I don't understand exactly how it would work, but it would have the opposite effect. So if you started with cancer, like a cancer matter, and then you diluted that to the point where it's gone, and then kept diluting the water, it would actually have sort of a negative polarity to the original matter that was in the water, I guess would be the theory behind it.
Well, that's definitely a homeopathic concept that like cures like. So, for example, in in homeopathy, they could take a poisonous material like arsenic, and it's noted that if you take arsenic, you get certain symptoms that are indicative of arsenic poisoning. But if you take it now and you do the homeopathic dilution, where the arsenic is no longer present, but the information is present, and now it becomes medicinal, and it cures those qualities. So, if you have arsenic and it gives you like severe headaches and metallic taste, when you're taking it in bulk, if you have those symptoms, you take a homeopathic dilution of arsenic, and it will cure those symptoms. So, same idea with the cancer cell. If you have a cancer cell and you dilute it far enough out, then that homeopathic dilution will actually be curative towards the cancer effect.
And that might give some credence to urine therapy or spagyrics with urine. You give you a feedback healing loop.
Yeah, and the whole drinking of urine, it's supposed to not become potentized until it's passed through at least 7 times. So you would have to drink the same urine 7 times before it becomes medicinally powerful.
So would you fast while you did that, Robert?
Yeah, generally they do a fast with wine or water, a low-salt diet, if you eat at all. But generally people would fast and do the urine drinking thing. Even a small amount of urine, I hear, is medicinally powerful. So if you were to take just 5 or 6 drops of urine and dilute it into a shot of water and take that, it has medicinal qualities and certainly more palatable.
I'm not sure I'm going to run out and try it tonight, but...
Well, I got some in the back basement. I might try it here in a minute.
I've been waiting 20 years to do it. Robert, are there any other, I guess what you would say, practices that involve kind of spiritual healing or help that are, I mean, your books are kind of on lab work, laboratory, practical alchemy. But what about types of meditation or, different related things? I mean, I don't know. It could even be sun gazing. I don't know. But are there any other things that you're kind of interested in or that you recommend to people?
Oh, sure. I mean, the books are mainly laboratory alchemy because that information is really hard to find. As far as spiritual practices and meditations or mantras or even ceremonial magic, you can find a lot of information on that. And so I kept my books mainly on the practical laboratory work. But the idea of spiritual practices, working in conjunction with laboratory work, that's very common and very, important. Like we mentioned, the quality of your thoughts, at any stage along the alchemical process do influence the work that you're doing. So there are so many practices and types of spiritual work that people are drawn towards. I don't really favor one over the other because ultimately the end point is the same, similar to the internal works of the Taoist alchemy of circulation of energy, developing energy, and there are various ways of doing that, and different people have different comfortable levels for doing that. So some people do the full ceremonial magic thing. I mean, they'll start with their material, say an herb, and they'll put it through a whole initiation ceremony, to draw it up into basically from the outer darkness into the light. And so each part of their alchemical process will be part of that initiation journey of the aspirant, the neophyte, going up towards adepthood. Other people just use various mantras or meditations during their works. There are different ways of working light, of actually impressing light into your materials. Spiritual energy. You develop the internal flow of your own spiritual energy, and then impress that into materials like charging a talisman or something of that nature. So, I mean, the technology for doing that is very wide and common to most, spiritual traditions. So, I'm not here to have you decide on one spiritual tradition or another, because alchemy is really universal. It'll work with any spiritual tradition or doctrine. And, whether you use prayer or ceremonial magic or various Kung or Qigong methodologies for developing and directing energy, that's up to the individual to decide.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. Oh, by the way, one other thing we didn't get around to yet is some of your, I guess you would say, classes, some of your events. I mean, there was an alchemy conference recently, right?
Yeah, right. Last month.
And you organized that, right?
Actually, my wife did, and it was kind of a protest from previous conferences that had been held down in L.A. mostly. They were taken over by big investors who had their own agenda to sell, and so people came there expecting, alchemy, and they got subjected to all this New Age stuff that these various contributors were trying to push out there, and had very little to do with actual alchemy. A lot of it was psychology and, a lot of psychobabble stuff. And New Age that, it's along alchemical ideas, but not the traditional alchemy. And so my wife said, I'm going to make my own conference. And so she just kind of pulled it out of thin air, and it manifested here. And it was strictly, traditional alchemical concepts, and people really enjoyed it. It was pretty successful.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. And you also have classes now and then, right?
Right. We teach regular classes here. We have a laboratory we've set up, and we teach a series of 3 classes. They're Prima, Secunda, and Tertia. Each one is a 3-day intensive class, and the Prima is all about theory, history, and practice of herbal alchemy. And so you get the theory, but also the practical hands-on working with herbs. We go out and actually gather our own herbs, and we work with them and process them, show you the various methods, how to derive the various products from the herbs. And I like to show people how to do these cheaply. You don't have to go out and invest in laboratory equipment. I show people how they can do it with things that they probably have laying around the house, or if not, they can find them easily in a thrift store or a hardware store. So it's not like a big investment in a laboratory. That comes later if you're really interested. But I call it guerrilla alchemy because it's something you can do cheaply and on the fly. Secunda takes up from the plant work. We move on to the water work, work with salts and work with minerals that are of animal origin, like bone and horns, antlers, hooves, feathers, hair, that kind of thing. And then Tertia, the final class, transitions into the actual metallic works. So we talk about various methods of manipulating metals and minerals to derive medicinal tinctures and elixirs from the metallic world. And each class builds on, the previous class, so it gets more and more intense as you go along.
And can people bring a tent?
Many do. We have 5 acres here, and there's plenty of camping space. We're out on the Tulalip Indian Reservation, so it's all wild land around us, and plenty of herbs for our experiments. But yeah, people come out and they camp out in tents. We have a couple of covered areas where people can take shelter if they need. And people camp out, have a good time. Things go on all night long. Classes are long. We start about 9 a.m. and we generally close up about 6 or 7. And then we have experiments going during the night. So it's a very intensive class, and people generally will stay close at hand here. There are hotels close by, but people like to camp out and get the full experience,
Okay, well, I guess we're just about ready to wrap it up. One last question would be, with that conference, was there anything interesting that came out of it? Anything of note?
A lot of interest, people in the area, and we had people from all around. We had people from back east. I think one was from Massachusetts. We had a couple from Nebraska, California, Oregon. But there's a growing interest, and people have realized that this technology is difficult to find, and this is an area where we're willing to share what we've found out, and it's something that's difficult to get someone to actually be right there and show you, and so people really appreciated that, being able to actually see demonstrations and do hands-on things and really have their questions answered right away. Alchemy isn't something that you can read on the internet or read in a book and really get it. It's always been an oral tradition, and once you take the classes, you realize why that is, because it's very intense and in depth, and sometimes you need to have questions answered right away to make the flow continue, and you can do that in classwork, and you can actually see things and handle things, and it's a totally different dimension than trying to get it by yourself, by trying to read it. It's very difficult.
Yes, indeed. I can say that from personal experience. Okay, Robert. Well, thanks for coming, being a special guest this week. We appreciate it. Oh. And I guess that will do it for now.
That's great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Robert. That was fascinating.
Thanks. I appreciate you guys, giving me a call, and I hope your listeners will share our interest. And like I say, classes are available. You can look on our website online to find the schedule. It's a very fascinating subject, alchemy, and one that is coming into vogue again. Alchemy has come into vogue and gotten pushed into suppression again. I think this is one of those periods where it's coming back out again, and people are seeing the value in this, supposedly ancient technology, which is actually quite advanced and fully in line with modern technology and ideas.
All right. Well, on behalf of Time Monk Radio, thanks again, Robert, and thank you to everybody for listening.